Next slide. You want to make sure your birds have a plentiful supply of grit. This basically supplies the teeth to the bird to grind up and digest grasses and other pasture plants, as well as the grain. You want to feed that free choice in a separate feeder with the grain, and you want to start them on grit when they're chicks. In fact, we start them on a calcium formulation of grit that you can buy locally, either at Spence Hardware or probably 4-Star Supply or Big R at Lewiston. And you want to sprinkle it on the chick starter when you're starting your birds to get grit into their system right away. And as they grow, you want to supply it free choice in a separate grit feeder. And again, you can buy the limestone chick-type grit at those locations that I mentioned. And then as the birds get older, you can convert them over to ground granite. And the other thing that we found over the years is we actually buy basalt fine rock. We buy it by the truckload. It seems to work really well because conventional grit at the farm feed store is pretty expensive. It helps the birds perform well, but it just costs a lot. So we feed the fine basalt rock to our adult chickens as well, and that helps to save on monies. Turkeys consume vast quantities of grit, so you really want to make sure they have it, and they can actually take a little larger crushed rock size, up to a 1/4 inch on the crushed rock. And you can also sip this out off the edges of your county road. The road department won't even hardly miss it, and it's kind of a good, quick way to save a few bucks and sneak a few fines off of the roadside. Okay, next slide. Here's a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart, no pun intended. It's broiler heart failure, and the fast-growing Cornish-crossed birds are susceptible to it, also known as flip-over disease. To prevent flip-over in broiler chickens, you got to limit feed consumption. Starting at about 7 to 10 days of age, you got to pull the grain feeders at night at about 7 o'clock or 8 p.m. depending on your day, and return those feeders the next morning at around 7. You've got to cut back on the amount of feed they eat because basically their growth rate exceeds what their heart can handle, and you've got to continue this until slaughter. In fact, we've even seen the red broilers and the Freedom Ranger chickens die of this as well. They just are growing so fast that you got to limit the feed. Of course, an alternative would be to just let the birds run out of feed each evening, but we found over the years that this is a little bit hard to gauge at times, and so, but if you can gauge it and you can let the feeder run out, that works too. Kind of a sister condition or associated condition that broiler chickens also get is ascite syndrome, and basically conditions that are real cold and wet when the birds are out on pasture especially leads to ascites. And you can tell when your birds are getting ascites because they'll start looking real purplish around their head and their comb area. And it's also sort of a cardiopulmonary type condition, and basically it just slows down their circulation until they finally succumb to it and they die of congestive heart failure. Again, keeping the birds warm, keeping the birds dry, avoid turning out on pasture that's cold and wet. Basically, don't buy your chicks when it's real cold and then expect to turn them out on a pasture and even in a covered hoop house, during the colder parts of spring. You really want to wait and put those birds out on pasture when it's somewhat warm and dry, so you don't have those pasture losses from ascites. It could be a real problem in fast-growing broiler birds, especially. Next slide, Cinda. Sanitation, just like Melissa was saying in her presentation, is critical, especially in chickens. Got to clean out the brooding facilities between chick batches, and I know that Joel Soliton isn't always a fan of this, the guru of pastured poultry, but boy, we sure like cleaning it out. The other alternative, of course, according to Soliton, is to aerate the bedding to ensure proper composting action in the chip pack. On the pastured birds, you want to limit your pastured pens, if they're 10-foot by 12-foot standard size pens, to about 50 to 60 birds per pen. Here in the Northwest, where we feed a lot of barley, barley leads to sticky droppings, and so you got to keep those pastured pens moving so they stay clean and move them as needed. Okay, next slide. Got to prevent losses due to predators, and I'm going to skip over this pretty quick because basically it's the same type of fencing options that Melissa covered. They got to be secure. If you're using hot wire, it's got to be tight. And you got to plug any holes on your pasture pens so so raccoons and weasels can't just go right under the thing and in. But the perimeter electric fencing helps to keep the predators even away from getting up right next to the pasture pens. So, next slide. Just also, as Melissa was outlining in her presentation, I wouldn't raise pasture poultry without Electronet. It's great. About $1 a foot. You can link multiple rolls together. It's great for surrounding broiler chicken pens and especially for turkeys. Love it. Next slide. And again, as I mentioned, you're moving your pasture pens as needed, depending on your system, either daily or every 2 to 3 days. You can use a hand truck, a dolly. We pull them with pickups. We pull them with four-wheelers, ATVs. And trying to move those pasture pens within an Electronet enclosure and setting it up so you don't have to move the Electronet every day. You just move the mobile pasture pen on a daily basis, or a little bit longer as needed. And I'm going to cover an alternative type system where you're not moving it exactly every day here in a minute. Next slide. As far as breed considerations for broiler chickens, we've raised all types. The Freedom Rangers are excellent foragers. They have a moderate growth rate, and they have real bad temperament. I guess that's all I can say about them. They're pretty doggone good birds. They lead to real high quality meat, but they're a challenge to raise. I guess when you go to gather them, my suggestion is do it when it's dark, wear eye protection, and get ready for flying, ricocheting birds around the pasture pen, because boy, they can really move and they can really smack you in the face. Cornish cross are faster growing. They lead to a really large carcass. They're docile and they die easily from many different causes. So they're a good bird to raise, but they've got their own set of problems, especially a lot of problems with the feet and legs. In 2011, we returned entirely to Cornish cross after growing the Freedom Ranger birds, because we just felt we had more problems with the Freedom Rangers, and they were just a little too slow growing for a commercial operation like ours. But don't let me influence you on that. I'm just trying to tell you, what we found. You really got to try it for yourself and see how it works in your own situation. There's a picture of the red broilers, or the Freedom Rangers, if you will, on the left, and then regular Cornish cross on the right. Next slide. Just had to mention laying hens. I know it really wasn't on my docket to talk about them, but just wanted to hit on them real quick, because a lot of folks around here are producing their own eggs now. It really is catching on. Brown egg versus white egg producers, Leghorn versus larger breeds, whatever you prefer. The sky's the limit on type of system and type of hens for your system. Pasture systems work well. Egg mobiles, as Soliton invented back there in Virginia, work really well along with the Electronet system that I showed you. In the egg mobiles, you can put nesting boxes, roosts, and of course you can even see inside of our egg mobile right there, we've got a heat lamp for wintertime use. Again, feed for layers, 16 to 18% protein, adding some calcium carbonate or ground limestone plus the NutriBalancer. Oyster shell grit to keep the, oyster shell and grit, free choice, and clean water are important. And the oyster shell, of course, is for eggshell quality to try to keep that calcium up, in addition to the ground limestone you're going to add to the feed anyway. And by the way, that's a really cool type of heat lamp there. It won't burn the barn down if it falls down into the straw. Next slide. Alfalfa hay for your hens during the winter is a good idea. They really need a little bit of green forage, keep those omega-3s up in the eggs. You want to have alternative winter quarters at times for a little bit more indoor use for those hens that are out on stubble or pastures, so they got a little bit more room to just stay inside. And again, that type of heat lamp that doesn't burn the barn down. By the way, you can get those heat lamps from Premier Sheep Supplies, like Melissa was showing in her presentation. Next slide. Okay, and we're going to transition on, I think, on the next slide to pasture management, and I'm going to try to move right along because I think we're rapidly running out of time. Birds follow the herds in poultry, and again, 10 by 12 foot pens. about 50 birds per pen. Next slide. And basically you're following your sheep or your cattle with the birds, just like you see in the plains of Africa. Sheep in our system graze a paddock for 2 to 3 days, follow them left with chickens, moving the chicken pens to a new spot, depending on the system, daily or within a few days. And looking for a good aggressive cool season type grass such as smooth brome or a weedy sod forming grass like meadow foxtail work well for chicken systems. Next slide. And we've really covered the daily moves, or the 3 to 4 day moves. I want you to look at this picture though. This is the picture of the system that we ultimately went to. It's called the net frame system, where you've got an overhead net suspended by a system of pipes that completely cover an enclosure of 4 hoop houses, so the birds are not locked up in the hoop houses, but can spread out over the entire pen. And this gets the chickens out. They rarely spend a lot of time in the hoop houses, and we move this system every 3 to 4 days, both net frames as well as net. Next slide. And you can see there we build a trailer to move the gear on the moving day. On that lower picture you can see the net frame with the net piled up on the middle of it. So you fold the net in on the middle net frame, you move the houses forward with a tractor. They're all cabled together so we could move them in 2 moves. And then you move the net frame with the net on it last and spread the net back over the houses. The whole thing's enclosed, but with electronet around the perimeter. You're predator proof. No coyote or wolf or badger or raccoon's going to get into that. Next slide. And that's a Soliton type pasture pen out on pasture back in the days when we didn't have such a predator load as we've had the last few years. Next slide. Okay, I think we're into processing and marketing pasture poultry. Next slide. Poultry are processed on our farm over the past few years under a permit from the State Department of Ag. You can process up to 1,000 broilers or chickens per year. Got to test your water, have a site plan that's approved by WSDA, and an inspected site. A little bit easier in Idaho. The health department mostly regulates it. You're not quite as regulated in Idaho as you are in the Washington side of things. Next slide. Got to handle birds as gently as possible before processing, and when you're gathering in the pastured pens, we use 2 foot tall by 6 foot long plywood sheets to guide chickens into the corner of the pen. When you're picking your birds up, you want to pick them up around the middle or by the legs, but never ever pick up a broiler chicken by the wings. You'll break the wings and it'll cost discounts when you go to sell the birds. You can see the crates that we use in the picture there, along with the blood trough below the kill cones. Next slide. There's my simple kill cone setup with a trough made from an old combine clean grain elevator. The birds are placed in the cones, cut the carotid artery, blood goes into the trough and is captured for composting in a barrel at the bottom of the trough. Next slide. After the birds are killed, they're dunked in 150-degree water in my custom scalder, and we dunk them about 13 to 16 times depending upon the exact temperature of the water, but again you're shooting for about 148 to 150 degree scald water. Next slide. After scalding, they go into our rotary defeathering machine. This is a Featherman defeather made back in Missouri, and it'll strip the feathers off in about 15 to 25 seconds, 4 birds at a time. It's a real slick machine. You can also do this with a drum plucker or by hand. Viscerating table is what we use with a plastic sheet across the top. Next slide. And that's just a picture of our permit for pasturing or for slaughtering pastured birds. Costs $75 a year in Washington for the permit for broiler chickens and turkeys and waterfowl.